There are revenges that need no knives, no blood, only a woman who has stopped crying. In the warm kitchen of Virginia, Eleanor bent down to wipe the floor while her daughter-in-law told her she was useless now. They didn't know that, at that very moment, a quiet storm had begun. A mother, after half a lifetime of being erased, was about to reclaim herself. Before we begin this story, let me know where you are listening from in the comments below. My name is Eleanor. I'm 68 years old, and what I'm about to tell you today will forever change the way you see your own family. Sunday dinners always carried the scent of a ceasefire. Garlic lingering in the air, rosemary lightly burning on the stove, the clinking of glasses masking the words people didn't want to say. In this Virginia suburb, everything was coated in a layer of pretense. White columns, evenly trimmed lawns, and memorized smiles. Everyone pretended to be fine. I brought the offering of peace, a lemon tart glazed with crisp caramel, rimmed with bright raspberries like a tiny red choir. It had taken 3 hours and a pair of shaky hands, but hands still patient enough to create beauty. The tart was my flag of truce, my way of saying, I'm still useful. I can still make something sweet for others. Wow, Mom, that looks amazing, said Michael, my son, as he opened the door. His smile reached only halfway to his eyes, as if afraid that if it went any further, something might break. He had his father's face, but my gentle gaze. Sophie's setting the table. You're right on time. I let him take the tray and stepped inside. Sophie was in the kitchen, gleaming and perfect, like something from a home magazine. She wore a cream-colored sweater, the kind that clung to her more than she to it. Her hair was neatly tied up, pristine, as if she'd never known the smell of grease or smoke. On the refrigerator hung Ethan's drawing, a pirate ship, pinned between a crowded work calendar and a postcard from somewhere I'd never been invited to. Sophie, I greeted her, my voice as even as ever. Oh, hello, Mother Eleanor. She said my name as if reciting a password. I set the tart on the counter and said softly, It needs to rest an hour. The caramel will set just right, crisp enough to crack. Perfect, she replied without looking up. She sliced watermelon, quick, efficient, cold. Oh, and Mother, there's a spill by your feet. I bent down, grabbed a napkin. At my age, bending had become second nature, both emotion and a habit of survival. The cold floor seeped through my jeans, mixing with the scent of lemon, disinfectant, and silence. I wiped slowly, gently, as if apologizing for still existing. Then Sophie stepped closer. Her voice brushed my shoulder, soft as velvet, sharp as a blade. Careful, Mother, she murmured. You might trip. You're not as useful as you used to be. Leave it. The maid will handle it. I heard every word, not because they were loud, but because they were true. That kind of sound, thin as a hairline crack in glass, quiet but spreading endlessly. The napkin froze in my hand. Time froze with it. I inhaled. Once, I would have smiled, made a joke, said something gentle to smooth things over. But this time, something shifted inside me. A lock turned open. I stood up straight. My knees clicked softly but didn't tremble. I placed the napkin on the counter, right beside Sophie's knife. When I lifted my head, my eyes met hers, not with hatred, but with just enough coldness to unsteady her balance. My voice came out calm, deliberate. Thank you for your concern, and it's good to know there's a maid in the house. Sophie froze. She hadn't expected me to answer. Her lips curved into a smile that never touched her eyes. Michael turned back, standing between us, a bit uneasy. "Everything okay?" he asked, a note of worry in his voice. "Everything's fine," Sophie said quickly. I added, "I just wiped a spill. All done now." Dinner began. The table was grander than necessary. The tablecloth trailing like a ceremony, the dishes so polished you could see everyone's tired reflections in them. Ethan talked about a game at school, how he got to be the shark and swallowed all his friends. I laughed, kept asking him questions to keep him talking. Sophie spoke about her store. "We're expanding the brand. This new partnership will change the quarter." Michael nodded, sipping his wine, as if every word she said were gospel. I listened, didn't interrupt, didn't ask, just stayed silent. I used to think silence was a kind of love. Now I knew it could also be the way you made yourself invisible. When dessert came, everyone praised the tart. So crisp, so fragrant, perfectly tart. But no one asked for the recipe. I cut myself a small slice, eating slowly. The lemon shone like late-season sunlight. The burnt sugar clung to my tongue. I thanked myself for still knowing how to make something flawless. When the meal ended, I stood to help clear the table. "Oh no, Mother. Let me," Sophie said, her tone light but final. "You rest. The maid will wash." I smiled. "I'll just put the plates in the sink." In the kitchen, she turned, speaking softly, just for me to hear. "I didn't mean anything earlier. The floor is slippery, you know how it is. Age and all. You understand?" I looked at her. "I do. And I also know you said exactly what you meant." She gave a strained smile, said nothing. Michael came in, breaking the tension. "Coffee, Mom?" "No, thank you. I'm heading home." Sophie raised an eyebrow. "So soon?" "It's late. Night driving isn't good." I lied. The house was 15 minutes away. Ethan ran out to see me off. He held up his Lego dragon, beaming. "Grandma, it can breathe fire." I bent down and whispered, "I know, because you're the one who taught it." He laughed, gap-toothed, eyes bright. I kissed his hair, sweet as sugar, warm as memory. In the car, I sat a long while before starting the engine. Light from their house reflected on my windshield. Every window a little stage where I no longer had a role. The empty tart tray sat beside me. I looked at that emptiness and realized I'd left too many parts of myself on tables like that. When I started the car, the radio hummed softly. A sad song, tender, stretching, like a road with no destination. I didn't feel angry. I felt clear. That feeling wasn't loud. It was like placing your palm on the table and knowing you'll never wipe another spill again. When I got home, moonlight poured through the garden, turning the azalea bushes into old women with silver hair bowing low. I washed my hands, dried them on an old towel. My hands, veined but steady, like my mother's once were, when she stopped apologizing for things she hadn't done wrong. In the living room, the small metal box sat quietly on the shelf. Inside was a green folder labeled "The Ledger of Silence." It had been waiting for me a long time, and I knew, tonight, for the first time, I was ready to open it, but not yet. I stood in the kitchen, looking at my reflection in the glass door. I smiled. Not the kind of smile meant to please anyone, but the smile of someone who has finally heard herself. On the counter, a single raspberry had rolled away from the tray. I picked it up, placed it in my mouth. Its sweetness mixed with tartness, just like life itself, bitter and true. I swallowed slowly, as if swallowing a vow, then whispered, "Enough." And in that silence, there was the sound of a door opening for the first time from the inside. I didn't cry when I got home. The house was bathed in a soft, weary yellow light, the kind I left on every night to trick the loneliness. The door clicked shut behind me, a small sound that echoed far in the near absolute quiet. I set my purse on the chair, removed my earrings, my ring, each gesture like shedding a role I no longer wished to play. The sink still smelled faintly of old dish soap. I turned on the kettle and listened to the rising boil, the only sound in a house far too used to silence. This kitchen had once been where my husband and I laughed the most. He's been gone for more than 10 years, but sometimes I still feel him standing in that corner, lighting a cigarette and smiling. Brought the whole world home to cook with you again, Eleanor? After he passed, I reorganized everything. The dishes, the tablecloths, even the teapot. But I kept his chair. It wobbles a little, its legs worn thin, yet I couldn't bear to throw it away. Maybe because it's the only thing left that still talks to me when I'm quiet. I poured hot water into the cup. Steam rose like mist, thin, trembling, then vanished. Like me. After dinner with Sophie, I felt something inside me crack. Not from anger. Anger is loud. This was something else. Slow burning, cold, and terrifyingly clear. I walked to the living room corner and opened the filing cabinet beneath the shelf. The lock gave a dry click, like an old heart beating through a rainy night. Inside lay a small world of paper, receipts, bills, copies of contracts, the quiet evidence of a life no one really saw. And in the middle of it all was a green folder, labeled with a strip of yellowed tape, the Ledger of Silence. I set it on the table. The cover was worn, the corners curled, but the letters remained sharp. I opened the first page. The first line, in my tidy handwriting, dated June 2013. House purchase support. Michael and Sophie, $40,000. Next page, September, the same year. Credit card debt repayment. Sophie, $3,200. Then December. Mortgage interest, 6 months, $9,500. I turned the pages. Each number was a slice of memory. Each line, a time I'd brushed aside my own small wants to help. One payment for Ethan's school tuition. Another for an urgent investment. Another for business expansion. At first, I wrote them down just to keep track. Then, I kept writing so I wouldn't lose my mind. Some nights, I'd sit beneath the lamp and record every number as if telling the story of my life in the only language that doesn't lie. Numbers. People do. On the last page, one line stood alone, written last year, then never looked at again. Total, 257,142. A number both precise and meaningless. I once thought I was investing in my son's future. Now I realize I was only buying my right to exist in their story. No one loves the invisible, but everyone needs someone who can pay on time. I leaned back, closed my eyes. The house was so quiet, I could hear my own heartbeat, slow, steady, like a clock that no one had remembered to wind. I opened my laptop. The screen glowed, reflecting a face lined with age, but lit by a sharp, unfamiliar clarity. I dragged a file to the center. Household support, Eleanor Dex LSX. Columns of figures stretched like a timeline. 2013, 2023. 10 years. 10 years of turning love into receipts. A chart appeared, my expenses climbing like a cliff, my income trailing as a tired slope. If this were a heartbeat, it would have broken long ago. I closed the laptop. And then, in my head, came that old, gentle voice, my husband's. You've always had the habit of keeping everything, even those who never kept you. I smiled faintly. He was always right. I walked to the small hallway cabinet and opened the bottom drawer. Inside was a wrinkled envelope filled with travel brochures, gallery invitations, and a crumpled flyer for a small art studio cabin near Lake Placid. I pulled the flyer out. The colors had faded, the edges torn, but the words were still legible. Where art meets peace. I remembered the day I almost called to book it. Phone in hand, trembling with excitement, I had been so close to touching a dream. Then the phone rang. Michael, his voice urgent. Mom, Sophie's in financial trouble. Could you help? Just for now? I had looked out the window, the sunset bleeding across the wall like dried blood. I folded the flyer, set it aside, and said, Of course, sweetheart. I'll take care of it. I hadn't realized that in that moment, I'd chosen silence over my own dream. Now, I placed the flyer beside the ledger of silence. 2 lives lying side by side. One I had lived, and one I had lost. I brewed another cup of tea. The steam rose, warm but biting. Outside, the rosemary bushes were still standing. We had planted them together, he and I. He used to say, Rosemary is memory, Eleanor. It reminds us who we've been. I bent down, pinched off a sprig, and rolled it between my fingers. The scent rose. Strong, direct, honest. Memories are like that too. No matter how long you bury them, they find a way to bloom. I went back inside and sat at the table. I took a blank sheet of paper and wrote, in black ink, my hand trembling but firm. I've lived half my life as a savior, but I never asked, who will save me? Silence isn't virtue. It's the debt I've paid with my own disappearance. I folded the paper and slipped it inside the ledger of silence. Not to hide it, but to leave proof that I once knew exactly where I went astray. Outside, the wind began to rise. The trees brushed against the wall, whispering something I couldn't yet understand. Maybe it was him, or maybe it was just my own voice. Finally daring to speak, I stood and turned off the kitchen light. The only glow left came from the small lamp, falling gently over the green folder like a quiet promise. I looked at it one last time before going to bed. I didn't know why, but I felt peace. Not the peace of forgiveness, but the peace of someone finally waking from a long dream. I whispered softly, for no one but myself to hear. Silence has its limits. And in the darkness, I heard the ticking of the clock. Not the rhythm of time, but the heartbeat of a woman who had just begun to remember her own worth. That morning, I woke to the scent of cold mint tea. Light slipped through the curtains, thin as silk threads, falling across the wooden table where an old sheet of paper still lay motionless, the flyer for the art studio in Lake Placid. I sat up, still wrapped in my husband's old wool robe. The sunlight glinted on the frayed fibers, turning them silver, a gentle reminder that time doesn't kill memories, it only softens them. That flyer. I'd kept it for 10 years. A decade gone by, the paper had yellowed, the folds worn like scars across a hand. Yet the image remained the same. A small pine cabin beside a still lake, the water mirroring a gray-blue sky. A woman stood on the porch, brush in hand, hair loose in the wind. Small, solitary, yet peacefully whole. I used to think that woman might have been the version of me I almost became. I remember the first day I found the flyer. It was a rainy afternoon, and I was waiting for the bus on the corner of Maple Avenue. A gust of wind blew it against my shoe, drenched. Across the paper were the words, Lake Placid Art Retreat, where art meets peace. I brought it home, dried it out, and pinned it to the refrigerator with a heart-shaped magnet. Every morning as I brewed coffee, I looked at it like a door that opened into another life, a life that belonged only to me, full of color and of true quiet. I almost called to book it. It was spring of 2015, cherry blossoms in full bloom, the sky a pale blue. I had just gathered the last of my husband's insurance money, and for the first time in years, I dared to think, maybe it's my turn to live. I still remember dialing the number printed in the corner. A gentle, warm, female voice answered. "We have one cabin left, ma'am. The lake is beautiful in summer. People come here to find the part of themselves they've lost." I smiled and said, "Maybe that's exactly what I'm looking for." We set a date for payment. I carefully wrote down the details. And then the phone rang again. Michael's name flashed on the screen. His voice trembled. "Mom, Sophie's in trouble. They're about to shut down the shop. We need your help. Just for now. I promise. Only this once." I sat there for a long time, pen still in hand. Birds chirped outside, steady and far away. I looked out at the garden. Once my dream, now overrun with weeds and ashes of leaves. I folded the flyer in half, then in quarters, my voice barely a breath. "All right, son, I'll take care of it." That sentence, "I'll take care of it," became my instinct after that day, the way others say, "It's fine." And from that day on, I stopped dreaming of Lake Placid. For 10 years, I never took the flyer out of the file box, not because I forgot, but because I was afraid. Afraid to look at it. Afraid of admitting how easily I had given myself up. But this morning, as sunlight passed through the window, the flyer seemed to glow differently. The little cabin in the picture looked as if it were calling me back, like an old dream finally waking. I placed my hand on the paper. It was cool, dry, but still carried the faint scent of ink and time, the smell of things that were never lived. I wondered, what if I hadn't answered that call? Maybe I'd be living in that cabin by the lake, waking each morning to the scent of oil paint and the whisper of wind. Maybe I'd be teaching children to paint, laughing more often, no longer lowering my head just to keep the peace. I once believed that sacrifice was love. Now I know. Sometimes, sacrifice is just a polite way of admitting you've stopped loving yourself. At noon, I took out the ledger of silence. I turned to a new page and wrote the title in bold, "Debts I Owe Myself." And then I wrote, "A trip that needs no one's permission. A painting I never finished. A day of doing nothing and feeling it's enough. A single no without guilt. A small house by the lake, even if only in memory." Then I stopped. Looking at the words, I realized I didn't just owe myself dreams. I owed myself forgiveness for wasting so many years trying to please others. I closed the book and took a deep breath. The midday air was dry, carrying the scent of wood, paper, and quiet. I heard the ticking of the clock, the sound of time I once resented, now strangely comforting. Because at least it was still counting for me. It was saying, there's still time. That afternoon, I opened the door to my studio. Light poured in, falling across dust thick as fog. Brushes lay stiff on the table, their bristles splayed like old hair. The palette was crusted with dried paint, cracked into tiny islands of color. I began to clean in silence. Each swipe of dust felt like brushing away a layer of petrified memory. I found the last painting I'd worked on, only swaths of blue, gray, and white. I remembered. I had meant to paint a woman by the lake. I never finished her face. Perhaps because I didn't yet know what it should feel. sorrow, relief, or freedom. Now I do. If I were to paint her again, I'd show her turning away, not crying, not smiling, just stepping out of the frame to keep living. I picked up a brush, dipped it in water. The dried paint dissolved slowly, turning the water a pale brown like earth. I set the brush down, inhaled deeply. No need to paint yet. Just looking at the blank canvas was enough to know I can begin again. To begin doesn't mean to be good. It only means to dare. That night, I sat by the window and wrote a small line on the edge of the Lake Placid flyer. If one day I disappear, find me here. I pinned it to the wall above the easel, no longer to hide, but to remind. I leaned back in the chair, watching the yellow lamplight reflect against the glass. The face in the window was older, but the eyes, bright, like the first time I ever dared to dream. That dream was never dead. It was only tired, only asleep for 10 years. And now it was slowly opening its eyes. I smiled and whispered to myself, 2 ledgers. One life I lived, one life I lost. It's time to balance the accounts. Then I turned off the light, leaving only the moon's glow reflected on the flyer. It was no longer just a piece of paper. It was a ticket home. Not to a place, but to myself. 2 months passed, so quiet I could hear the slow shifting of each day. No phone calls, no messages from Michael or Sophie. No one asked if I was well. No one remembered that Sunday dinner that had splintered everything. But the silence felt light. I began to learn how to breathe again, to breathe like someone free, no longer afraid of being a burden. In the mornings, I rose early. I brewed tea, watered the plants, read old financial reports. I learned to see numbers as companions, not as things that appeared only when someone needed me to open my savings account. Each morning, I wrote a small quote on a slip of paper and stuck it to the refrigerator. Today's read: silence is not escape. It's the soul's period of recovery. I began to reorder my life, drawer by drawer, paper by paper, habit by habit. That was how I found the evidence of myself again. Who I had been, what I had given, what I had forgotten, what I had lost. One afternoon in May, while cleaning out the filing cabinet, I found a cream-colored envelope tucked between 2 old folders. In my handwriting, on the corner, Sophie contract, 2018. I had almost forgotten it existed. I pulled up a chair, sat down, and opened it. Inside was a notarized share transfer agreement. The first line made my heart pause. Party A, Eleanor M. Bennett, temporary financial investor. Party B, Sophie Hart, representative of Bloom and Nest. And then I remembered. That was when Sophie had her financial collapse. Her store was near bankruptcy. Michael had panicked. I'd transferred $60,000 to help them through a short-term storm. In exchange, Sophie had signed over 51% of the company, temporarily, until repayment. Just so you can feel secure, she'd said, smiling, her voice sweet as sugared tea. I had believed her. I folded the contract away and never brought it up again. Because I hadn't wanted control. I had only wanted peace. Now, with the paper lying on the table, it was no longer a record of kindness. It was proof of awakening. I placed my hand over Sophie's signature. The ink had faded slightly, but the pressure of the pen was still visible. The sweeping line of her S curved like a snake. Elegant, smooth, but with teeth. I smiled, not out of spite, but because fate, it seemed, had its own kind of order. Maybe, all these years, I thought I'd been deceived. I had, in fact, been laying the first stones of my return. I opened my laptop. The screen lit my face. Eyes shadowed, but sharp now, no longer blurred by grief. I opened a new email. To m.delaney@associates.com. Subject, ready to proceed. Dear Margaret, I found some old documents I think you should review. They concern ownership rights and an unpaid investment. Whenever convenient, let's meet. I want to confirm the legality of what's still mine. Best, Eleanor. I reread it once, made no edits. Those words. What's still mine carried their own weight, not just money, dignity, memory, voice. Minutes later, a reply arrived. Eleanor, I've been waiting for this day. Send the papers first. I'll prepare. Monsieur Margaret Delaney, the only friend who'd stayed in touch after I retired. Once a contract lawyer in a financial firm. Firm, meticulous, and allergic to the phrase weak woman. She used to tell me, we weren't born to be rescued. We were born to sign our own contracts with life. I used to laugh. Now I understood. 2 days later, I visited her office, a quiet building on a tree-lined street in Arlington, its glass facade reflecting rows of elms. Second floor, a modest sign, Delaney and Associates. The wooden door opened to the scent of coffee and printed paper. Margaret looked the same. Silver hair, bright eyes, a smile rarer than honesty. She greeted me with a short, precise hug, as if our friendship came with a clause about respect. I handed her the envelope. She put on her glasses and read, carefully, line by line, ink mark by ink mark. The light glinted across her lenses, dividing her face into brightness and shadow, like someone examining a memory only she could fully see. Finally, she nodded. Notarized, legal, no clause for expiration. You still hold controlling shares, Eleanor. You don't just have rights, you have leverage. I sat still. Her words made the room feel wider. I hadn't realized that for 10 years, I'd been holding something that could change the whole board. Margaret looked over her glasses. What do you plan to do? I answered slowly, firmly. Nothing yet. But if they try to push me out again, I won't leave empty-handed. She smiled faintly. I knew you'd say that. Then softer. Be careful, Eleanor. Justice isn't always clean. But if you step into it, step in with your own shoes. I nodded. I don't want a war. I just want them to learn. Silence has its limits. Driving home, I left the radio off. The road wound beneath the forest canopy, wind carrying the scent of pine and dry leaves through the window. I felt a strange, unfamiliar lightness, as though I'd been carrying a heavy bag for years and had just remembered I could put it down. When I got home, I made tea. While the water boiled, I took out the ledger of silence and turned to the last page. In blue ink, I wrote, May 17th, found the contract. I am not seeking revenge. I am reclaiming my place. I folded the notebook, placed it beside the contract and the printed email. The papers stacked together like layers of earth, each one a stratum of my life, compressed, endured, and now surfacing again. I looked at them for a long while, then blew out the candle on the table. The light vanished, but I wasn't afraid. In that darkness, I knew clearer than ever. I didn't need to be saved. I was saving myself, with pen, with law, with memory, and with silence sharpened to steel. Late that night, I opened the window, letting in the cold air. Outside, lavender mingled with damp soil. I closed my eyes and whispered, not as a prayer, but as a vow. At last, I've built a safety net for myself, not made of money, but of truth. And in that moment, I felt a strange, calm peace. Not because I had won, but because I no longer feared losing. That night, the wind smelled of rain. The rosemary hedge by the porch leaned as if it knew something was about to fall. Michael had called in the morning. "Come over for dinner, Mom. We have something to discuss." Dinners that were to discuss in this house rarely ended with dessert. But I went anyway. I wanted to look straight at what I'd avoided all my life, the feeling of being treated as the backup plan. The table gleamed, the cloth perfectly pressed. Ethan ran around hugging his robot, the scent of orange candles mixing with red wine. Sophie stepped out of the kitchen, groomed face, a smile thin as glass. "You're right on time. We were just talking about an expansion plan." Michael poured wine awkwardly. We ate for a few minutes to the polite clink of cautious cutlery. Sophie opened in a gentle voice. "The bank needs a co-signer. Just a formality. You won't have to pay anything, Mother." Michael added, "They trust you more than us." That wasn't a compliment. It was a shackle. I asked plainly, "How much is the loan?" $700,000, Michael said, eyes avoiding mine. "And if you can't pay it back?" "Oh, come on, Mom. Why so negative?" Sophie laughed. "This is an investment." I looked around the new house. Pendant lights, hand-woven rugs, the glossy wedding photo where I stood in the middle, trusting completely. I remembered another, just one signature. In 1984, I co-guaranteed for my husband. The company went under, he died of a stroke, and I paid the debt until my hair turned white. Just one signature is always costlier than people think. I set my glass down very slowly. "No, Sophie, I'm not signing anything." A fork scraped and stopped. Sophie arched a brow. "I'm sorry. What?" I said no. All my life I've signed to keep the peace, signed to save other people, signed to erase myself from the picture. I'm done. Michael hurried to soften it. "You're misunderstanding, Mom." I looked at my son, gentle but firm. "No, I understand better than anyone. You want money, Sophie wants the store, and I, as always, am the solution." Sophie's smile vanished. "What do you plan to do with your money? Buy paintbrushes? You're retired." The words were sharp as a knife, but I didn't flinch. "Perhaps you're right. I don't need much. But what I have, I won't pay for a life that isn't mine anymore." A hush fell. Even Ethan went quiet. I stood up. "Thank you for dinner. I'm going home." Sophie shot to her feet. "Eleanor, you're making a big deal out of this." I turned back, a small smile. "No, Sophie, I just stopped making it a small deal." Michael called after me, voice tight. "Mom, please, we're counting on you." I paused at the threshold. "No, Michael, you don't need a crutch. You need to learn to stand up straight. I can't keep being a life jacket for someone who won't learn to swim." Outside, the wind whipped the smell of rain against my face. I pulled my coat close and left the still-lit house, a place where the people I love live, but where I no longer belong. On the drive home, the wipers cleared the streaks of rain only for more to fall. Like my life, cleaning up again and again for others, to make a mess. When I got home, I didn't turn on the lights. I hung up my wet coat and let the drops patter onto the floor, a small sound that felt like a kind of release. I poured some wine, sat by the window, and watched the streetlights shatter into pieces on the glass. I took out the ledger of silence, opened to a new page, and wrote. "Tonight," I said, "no. After 68 years, I finally choose myself." I set down the pen and listened to the clock. Steady, sure. No triumphant soundtrack, only silence that had ceased to be a cage. I thought of all the times Mom will take care of it, swallowed my voice. The Lake Placid deposit folded away because of a phone call. The urgent bills with swapped names. The golden opportunities. The color of debt traps. I pictured the wooden cabin by the lake. Sloped roof. Birches standing still as if holding their breath. The woman in the photo. The version of me I almost became. Lifts her head. Steps off the porch, brush in hand. This time, I believe I'll make it in time. I opened the drawer and took out the 2018 contract, Sophie signing over 51% in exchange for $60,000 of temporary rescue. The notary seal, still crisp. I set the contract beside the ledger. They lay there like two faces of the same mirror. What I gave away and the power I quietly kept. I felt neither impatient nor vindicated, only clear. Silence was no longer endurance. It was the time a blade spends against the whetstone. I texted Margaret, "Fire tonight. Let's discuss next steps tomorrow." She replied at once, "I'm here." I put the phone away, stood, and opened the window. Rain as fine as silk, the scent of lavender and rosemary streaming in, clean and straight. In the garden, the lavender stalks bent low without breaking. I understood my body had just relearned that too. I felt my way to the studio that had been locked for years, switched on the light. Dust sparkled like stars in glass. A white canvas stood ready against the wall. I sat, took a dry brush, and dipped it into a cup of water. The old pigment bled out, the water turning a pale brown like soil after rain. I didn't paint. I just looked at the silent white surface. It's frightening because it's free. But that fear is the only kind worth living. I went back to the table, opened the ledger, and added, a signature I will not sign, a life I will not sell. The line of ink was straight as a boundary. On the left, the years of favor until emptiness. On the right, the life that remains. Fewer people, less noise, more truth. The phone buzzed. A text from Michael, short and flustered. "Mom, I'm sorry Sophie went too far. Will you think about it?" I stared at the screen for a long time, then locked it. I didn't reply. Refusing to answer is also an answer. I turned off the main light, leaving only the desk lamp to fall on the ledger, the contract, and the Lake Placid flyer I'd taped back on the wall. 3 thin, light objects, heavy as 3 anchors, turning the bow of my boat. Outside, the rain eased. The clock struck 11, the sound dry and warm. I raised my glass alone. No need to clink. No need for a toast. I whispered like a promise to myself. People only truly begin to live when they stop doing favors. A flash of lightning cut across the sky, bathing the room in brightness for a second. I saw my shadow on the wall, small, slight, but upright. This time, I did not bow my head. Before bed, I taped a slip of paper to the edge of the flyer. If one day I disappear, look for me on this lakeshore. I turned off the light. The house sank into a darkness that didn't threaten. The kind of night that belongs to someone who has finally heard her own voice. In the dark, I heard an old door close somewhere inside. Not a door on Michael or Sophie, but a door on the very kind of silence that once swallowed me whole. Tomorrow morning, I'll brew tea. I'll call Margaret. I'll reschedule with the Lake Placid cabin. If there's space, good. If not, I know the way. But tonight, this is enough. I said no, and the room inside my ribcage grew a size. Outside, the rain stopped completely. The wind flipped a page in the notebook. At the edge of the page, my letters dried, bold and neat. Enough. And just below it, a smaller line, tough and enduring as a stitch pulling together a lifetime's tear. From here, I choose myself. The next morning, The sky was a pale gray, the color of unwritten paper. No rain, but the air was heavy with leftover moisture clinging to the window ledge. I made tea, added a spoon of honey, and sat by the window watching the garden. The lavender stalks leaned with the wind, swaying softly as if conversing in a language only survivors understood. I thought the day would be peaceful, until I heard the knocking. Hard, hurried, sharp. Not the kind of knock from a mailman or a friendly neighbor. It was the sound of someone who wanted to break in, not visit. I opened the door. Michael stood on the porch, pale, shirt wrinkled. Beside him was Sophie, eyes swollen from crying, but her voice still carried fire. "We need to talk!" Her tone was a command. I stepped aside calmly. "Come in." They walked straight into the living room. Neither removed their shoes nor greeted me. The air in the house changed the moment they crossed the threshold. Thick, cold, carrying the scent of an approaching storm. On the table still lay the ledger of silence and the 51% ownership contract I'd placed there the night before. I hadn't put them away. Perhaps part of me wanted them to see. Sophie began, as if she had rehearsed in front of a mirror. "I don't understand why you're doing this, Mother. You emailed my lawyer. You sent things to Margaret. Are you trying to destroy our business?" I poured tea and set a cup before her. "Drink. Your voice is trembling." She slapped the cup away, tea spilling across the table. "Stop talking to me like that. Do you know this could ruin us?" I picked up a cloth, slowly wiping the spill. "You speak as if that would be my fault." Michael intervened, voice soft but shaking. "Mom, we don't want to fight, but this isn't fair. It's our store. Sophie's poured her whole youth into it." I laid the cloth down and looked straight at him. "And I've poured my whole life into you. And in all that time, fairness was never part of the conversation." Sophie let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "Oh, you're playing the victim now, aren't you?" I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I opened the green folder, turning each page. The sound of paper crackled through the room, steady, rhythmic, like the heartbeat of truth itself. "I just want you both to see what I call fairness." Page 1, Ethan's tuition, $38,000. Page 2, store, initial support, $60,000. Page 3, Sophie's credit card debt, $9,200. Page 4, mortgage payments, $14,500. Total, over $257,000, no interest, no conditions, no signatures. I turned the book so the writing faced them. "This is my 10 years of silence." Michael said nothing. Sophie looked down, her face shifting between confusion and fury. "So, you've kept this to hold it over us?" "No," I said. "To remember. Because if I don't, you'll pretend none of it ever happened." I slid another document across the table, the 2018 contract. The paper was thin, but when it hit the wood, it sounded like a nail being driven in. "Sophie, this is your signature. Notarized. 51% of Bloom and Nest temporarily in my name, in exchange for $60,000 of emergency aid. Tell me, have you ever paid it back?" Sophie opened her mouth, then closed it. Her hands trembled. Her voice shrank. "I thought you never mentioned it again. I thought you'd—" "I didn't give it. I just hadn't collected. Those are different things." Michael turned to me, pleading. "Mom, I know Sophie's made mistakes, but you can't use the law to punish us. We're family." I smiled, not mockingly, just tiredly. Family is where you're safe, not where you're drained dry. If you've forgotten that, let me remind you." Sophie slammed her hand on the table. "You have no right to take what I built." I replied quietly, evenly. And you have no right to build comfort on someone else's sacrifice without cost. Silence. The sunlight filtering through the curtains fell across their faces. Pale, cold light, stripped of warmth or sentiment, leaving only the bare truth. I walked to the window. You know, I said, when I was younger, I thought silence was a virtue, that if I endured long enough, people would see my kindness. Now I know silence only teaches people to forget you have limits. I turned back to Michael. I love you, son, but I won't let you teach your boy that women exist to pay the price. Sophie began to cry. Michael slumped into a chair, head in his hands. Then what do you want? He asked, voice breaking. Nothing, I said gently. And that's what you can't stand. I don't need anything from you anymore. I placed the 2 stacks of paper, the contract and the ledger, back on the table. Here lies everything that once tied us together. I'm not asking for money, not suing, not shouting. I'll let the truth do its work. Then I walked out of the living room and up the stairs. Behind me came the scrape of chairs, stumbling footsteps, a slammed door. I didn't look back. Upstairs, my room was full of light. I sat, hands resting on my knees, palms still warm from the teacup. I heard them leave, the car starting, tires crunching over gravel fading away. Silence returned. But this time, it wasn't empty. It was full, dense, carrying the weight of something that had finally been completed. I opened the ledger of silence and wrote another line. Today they saw me. Not the debtor, not the good mother. Just me, Eleanor. I put the pen down and smiled faintly. In the ticking of the clock, I noticed something strange. The sadness hadn't gone, but it had straightened itself, settled into its rightful place. That afternoon, I went into the garden. The air smelled of rosemary and damp soil. I cut a sprig and tucked it into my sleeve. Its scent was strong, honest, upright. I remembered what my husband said when he planted this bed. Rosemary to remember, lavender to let go. I closed my eyes. I've remembered enough, I whispered. Now I let go. On the porch, sunlight touched the table where the 2 sets of papers still rested. I didn't move them. I didn't need to, because finally, I didn't have to hide the truth. Not from anyone, not even myself. I went inside, opened the drawer, and took out an old frame, a photo of 3 people, me, Michael, and my husband. I wiped the dust from the glass, gazed long at the man's eyes. You see? I said softly. I finally learned how to say no without shaking. I set the frame back down, then returned to my desk and wrote one final line beneath the day's entry. I didn't win against anyone. I simply stopped losing to myself. Outside, the sun sank slowly. The evening light stretched thin like a ribbon, wrapping the room in its quiet warmth. I sat still, listening to my own breath, calm, steady, like someone who's walked out of a burning house and realized she's still alive. I knew that from today on, they would never look at me the same way again. They might be angry or frightened or ashamed, but for the first time, they would see me, not through roles, not through debts, but simply as Eleanor, flesh, blood, and a voice that had finally found its way home. I always thought justice was a distant notion, something that lived on the evening news, where people wore suits and said sentences no one really heard. I never imagined that at 68, I would be the central figure in a courtroom. But life has its own way of forcing us to look back at ourselves, with a summons that prints your name on the very first line. 3 weeks after the confrontation at the house, I received an envelope from the court. Inside, in bold type, Plaintiff, Sophie Hart. Defendant, Eleanor M. Bennett. Cause of action, elder coercion. I read it 3 times, then laughed. Not a joyful laugh, not a bitter one, just the irony of fate. The woman who had lived her whole life for others was now accused of coercion. Margaret called me that same day. Stay calm, Ellie. They're desperate. Let the law speak. I sat in the kitchen, turning a teacup in my hands. I'm not scared. I'm just sad, Margaret, because they truly believe the story they made up. She said, don't be sad. Truth always outlives words. The day in court. Fairfax was cold and gray. Winter came early this year. I wore an ash gray wool coat and a pale blue silk scarf, the color of stillness. I wore no jewelry, no nail polish, made no effort to look strong. I only wanted to look real. Margaret walked beside me, her steps even and sure. Let me handle the talking, she said. When needed, say only the truth. Nothing more, nothing less. We passed through the courthouse's wooden doors. The air inside was dense. Coffee, paper, and the stories of hundreds who had stood here, trying to prove they were not wrong. Sophie was already there. She wore a black dress, her hair in a high bun, a face carefully made up despite the fatigue. The cultivated kind of tired. Michael sat behind her, avoiding my eyes. When the judge entered, everyone rose. I heard the scrape of wooden benches on the floor like a collective sigh. Sophie's lawyer was first to speak. He was young, slick, smooth-voiced. Your Honor, he began. My client, Ms. Sophie Hart, has suffered significant harm after being coerced by her mother-in-law, Mrs. Bennett, into signing a share transfer agreement. For years, Mrs. Bennett exploited family ties to control my client's finances. Ms. Hart now seeks only to regain fairness. Every coercion, control, harm hit my ears like rain on a tin roof. Loud, but leaving nothing behind. I didn't react. When it was our turn, Margaret stood. She didn't look at opposing counsel, only at the judge. Her voice clear, steady, carrying a quiet force that settled the room. Your Honor, we have a notarized contract, voluntarily signed in 2018. Mrs. Bennett has never exercised the rights in that agreement. Over the next 7 years, she continued to support the plaintiff financially. Over $250,000, with no repayment, no collections. If anyone has been exploited here, it is my client. She held up the contract. The paper was pale yellow, corners slightly curled, the notary seal still sharp. There is no evidence of coercion, only trust, and trust betrayed. The judge, a silver-haired woman with bright eyes, examined the paper for a long moment. Then she turned to Sophie. Ms. Hart, do you acknowledge this as your signature? Sophie hesitated. She glanced at Michael, then answered softly. Yes, but at the time just yes or no. The judge cut in. Yes. She set the paper down, her voice even but cool. Then, the contract is valid. Mrs. Bennett's failure to exercise ownership for years indicates no attempt at appropriation. Your complaint has no basis. A heavy silence fell. Sophie went pale. Her lawyer started to speak, but the judge raised a hand. Motion denied. Case dismissed. The gavel struck 3 times, short, final, resonant. The sound felt like chains slipping from my wrists, not noisy but liberating. As people rose, Sophie broke into tears. Are you happy now? She cried, voice cracking. You won! I turned to her and looked for a long moment. No, Sophie, I said softly. No one won. Only the truth was put back where it belongs. Michael stepped forward, started to say something, then didn't. In his eyes, I saw something I'd never seen before. Shame. I only nodded and whispered, "Go home, son. You both need time." Then I walked out of the courthouse without looking back. Outside, the sky was a pale blue. The wind smelled of cold metal and exhaust, tugging at the scarf on my neck. Margaret walked beside me, silent for a while, then asked, "You all right?" I smiled. "All right. Just empty." She nodded. "Empty is normal. When you've carried too much for too long, putting it down makes your back feel strange." We paused on the steps. I looked at the white building behind us, its facade reflecting my true face back at me, stripped of the creases of guilt, with no one else's shadow in my eyes. "Margaret," I said, "I don't need money. I just need someone, once, to look at me and say, 'You've done enough.'" She placed a hand on my shoulder, squeezed lightly. I just said it. I laughed, a small, genuine sound. For the first time in years, it didn't break halfway. That evening, I went home. The house was dark, but not cold. I poured a glass of wine, switched on the small kitchen lamp. On the table, the ledger of silence still lay open to yesterday's page, the ink not yet faded. I sat and looked at the contract returned from court. Now it was only paper. No more power, no more tether. I laid a hand on it, feeling the thin grain as if tracing an old scar. No longer painful, only a reminder. I thought of Sophie. I didn't hate her. I only felt regret. Regret that she hadn't learned this. When your survival depends on others' softness, you will collapse the moment you meet someone who no longer wishes to rescue you. I added a line at the bottom of the page. The court did not grant me victory. It granted light. And in that light, I saw myself. The woman who once disappeared among numbers, now written again under her true name. I closed the ledger and set it beside the wine. Outside, wind hissed through the trees, sweeping up dry leaves. I could hear time passing. No longer urgent, only steady, reassuring. I turned off the lamp. Moonlight spilled into the room, soft and warm as an acknowledgement. I whispered, to no one in particular, "At last, I've been seen. Not because I fought, but because I stopped hiding." And in that light, for the first time in years, I felt free. Not free from other people, but from the silence that had bound me for half a lifetime. I used to think that once justice was restored, everything would return to normal, that I would make tea again, turn on the radio, tend to my plants, read the news, as if nothing had ever broken. But no, after the trial, my life did not return. It transformed. I slept 13 straight hours and woke in the pale light of morning. No dreams, no jolts awake, just a strange emptiness, like a room finally cleared after years of clutter. When you suddenly smell the old wood, the real air. I lay there, listening to the wind slip through the curtains, and smiled. Not because I was happy, but because, for the first time, I didn't need happiness to exist. I began again with something small. The garden. The backyard had been neglected for years. Weeds everywhere, cracked soil, piles of rotting leaves along the fence. I pulled on gloves and crouched down, my hands sinking into the dirt. The sensation startled me. The earth was cold, sticky, alive. So different from the cold papers and numbers I used to live among. I dug out weeds, pried up roots. Some were so deep, I had to brace both hands to pull them free. And then it struck me. A garden is like a life. To plant anew, you must be brave enough to uproot what's buried deep, even if it's become part of your own flesh. I planted rosemary, lavender, and mint. Resilient herbs, slow to grow, but steady, unyielding. I remembered what my husband once said when we planted together: rosemary to remember, lavender to let go, mint to begin again. Back then, I thought he was just being poetic. Now I know it was the language of survival. A few weeks later, the garden had changed. The soil softened, the wind grew gentle. Weeds still came, but less stubbornly. Each morning I brewed tea, carried a chair to the porch, and watched sunlight filter through the fence. No more sudden phone calls, no more cries for help, just birdsong, and the faint clink of a spoon against porcelain. Margaret visited one afternoon. She stood by the gate, looked around, and laughed. "My God, Ellie! You've turned this place into a monastery." I wiped my hands on my apron. "No, I'm just cleaning my house out of my head." She laughed, but her eyes softened. "You've changed." "Not really," I said. "I'm just learning how to exist without asking permission." We sat on the porch, 2 cups of steaming tea between us. Margaret asked, "Heard from Sophie?" "No. Why?" "The store's in trouble. Word is, they're about to close." I was silent. Part of me felt light. Another part just tired. "That's sad," I said. "But maybe it's the only lesson they're willing to learn." Margaret studied me, then said, "Someone asked why you didn't countersue. You could claim damages for defamation." I smiled faintly. Reputation isn't something you win back. It's something you rebuild by living. By late afternoon, sunlight slanted across the wall, painting the steps in thin gold. I received a handwritten letter, clumsy, childlike script. It was from Ethan. "Grandma, Mom says you're planting things. I drew you a garden. When you feel better, let's plant roses too. I miss you." Inside was a drawing, me in the garden, watering can in hand, flowers around my feet, the sun smiling overhead. That child, surrounded by adults who'd lost their way, still carried the purity the rest of us had misplaced. I sat quietly, the paper trembling in my hands. A tear dropped onto the edge, smudging the ink. I didn't wipe it away. I let it dry, proof that I could still feel. One morning, a message came. Sender, Michael. "Mom, the store is going bankrupt. Sophie's panicking. I know you don't want to hear it, but please help one last time. I swear I'll repay you. I promise." I read it. My heart didn't ache. It simply settled, like watching an old scene replay. I set the phone down and looked out at the garden. The mint had sprouted, bright, green, fearless, weaving among the lavender. The wind moved through them, whispering the answer for me. "Not this time, Michael. Not anymore." I opened the ledger of silence and wrote, June 8th. They asked again, and I said no again. For the first time, I feel no guilt. I closed the book. The quiet felt like a window in my chest had finally been unlatched. Then I started to paint. The old brush I found in a drawer, frayed but still soft in my hand. I set the easel by the window, where afternoon light slanted like silk. The first painting was of the cabin by Lake Placid, the dream I once folded away after a phone call for help. This time, I painted it complete. The slanted roof, the open door, a small wooden chair on the porch, a steaming cup of tea. When I brushed in the last color, I realized the cabin wasn't just a lost dream. It was a return. I sat and gazed at the painting for a long time, my heart still as the lake within it, and I whispered, "At last, I've painted myself into the picture." Margaret came again, carrying a flyer. "Women's Center wants you to speak," she said. "Finance and freedom for older women. You should do it." I'm no speaker, I protested. She grinned. You don't need to perform. Just tell the life you lived. So I did. At the first session, there were only 7 women. Gray hair, rounded shoulders, hands knotted together. They sat quietly, avoiding my eyes, as if just being there was something to be ashamed of. I didn't talk about money. I talked about silence. You know, I began. We often stay silent not because we're weak, but because we think love requires sacrifice. But stay silent long enough, and people forget you ever had a voice. An older woman, eyes red, said softly, I wish I'd heard that sooner. I stepped down and took her hand. It's never too late to remember who you are. When the talk ended, there was no applause. They simply stood and hugged me. And in those embraces, I saw myself, in dozens of versions, beginning to breathe again. That evening, I stood on my porch. The sun spread gold over the blooming lavender. I cut a few sprigs, placed them in a glass jar. Their scent filled the room, sweet and sharp, a reminder and a lullaby at once. I opened the ledger and wrote, Rosemary, to remember, lavender, to forgive, mint, to continue. I don't plant to forget. I plant to prove that even dry soil can grow roots again. I closed the book and turned off the lamp, letting the last of the daylight pour through the window. On the table, the painting of the cabin caught the light, looking almost alive. I whispered, a promise to myself. Now I understand. Freedom isn't going somewhere new. It's daring to stay with yourself. The wind passed through the porch, carrying the scent of rosemary into the room. The door trembled, the hinges creaked, sounding almost like laughter. I lifted my gaze to the purple sky. There was no one here, and no one needed to be. I was alive, truly, completely, and for the first time, not for anyone else. July came to Virginia heavy and damp. The sunlight no longer shone gold but dull, like old paint, and the wind carried heat from far away. I had grown used to this rhythm, watering the garden in the morning, reading at noon, painting in the afternoon, tea at night. No disruptions, no one knocking on the door. I once thought peace belonged only to those without burdens. But it turns out, peace doesn't come when we're forgiven. It comes when we finally stop being afraid. 3 months had passed since the trial. No word from Michael, no message, no letter. The house was so quiet, it felt as if the whole world had moved on without me. And strangely, I was grateful for that. I had learned to enjoy absence. Until that afternoon. The phone buzzed 3 times on the wooden table, between the hum of bees outside. I thought it was Margaret, asking if I wanted to join her at the Women's Center over the weekend. But when I looked at the screen, I froze. Michael. I opened the message. A few short lines, but heavier than all the long, weary years behind me. Mom, we're about to lose the house. Sophie's terrified. Ethan keeps asking where you are. I know you're tired, but please help. Just this once. I promise I'll pay you back. At the bottom was a single emoji. A broken heart. So small, yet it felt like staring back into the same pit I had spent a lifetime climbing out of. I sat still. My hand didn't shake. It only felt cold. The cold of awareness, not fear. Part of me, the old part, the mother who had survived by surrendering, stirred. My son is begging for help. How can I turn away? But another part, the survivor, the one who had learned to breathe in silence, whispered, if you save him, you'll go right back to the beginning. And this time, there will be no way out. I set the phone down. It hit the wood with a sharp, final sound. I looked out at the garden. The rosemary had rooted, the lavender bloomed, the mint spread thick and green. The whole garden seemed to say one thing: everything must endure to stand on its own. That night, I opened the ledger of silence. A fresh page, smooth pen, clean space. I wrote slowly, one line at a time. July 7th, they need again. I could help again. But this time, I choose not to. Not because I've stopped loving them, but because I've learned. Love must never be the noose of obligation. I set down the pen and inhaled deeply. The scent of ink mingled with the dried lavender hanging by the window. My heart was so still I could hear the clock ticking. I had forgiven them by ending the cycle of rescue. Late that night, I stood by the window. The moonlight was pale and hazy, spreading a thin mist over the garden. I opened a drawer and took out a blank envelope. No name. I meant to write to Michael, but changed my mind. I wrote to Ethan. I wrote slowly, as if speaking to the child I once was. The girl who believed love must always come with a price. Dear Ethan, Grandma hears that you're scared. I understand. Grown-ups often think children don't know fear, but children's fear is clearer, purer than ours. I was once afraid of losing my home, my people, my place in the world. But then I learned that when you lose everything, what remains is yourself. And that, Ethan, is enough to begin again. When you feel lost, plant something. Water it. Wait. The plant will teach you how to stand tall. Something no one else can teach. I love you, and I hope you grow up knowing this. Loving others should never mean forgetting to love yourself. With love, Grandma Eleanor. I folded the letter, sealed it, and wrote the address. No return name. They didn't need to know who it was from. I only wanted the seed inside that letter to find soil somewhere. The next morning, I took it to the small post office on the corner. The old postman smiled when he saw me. It's been a while since you've sent a letter. Yes, I said. It's been a long time since I wrote something that truly mattered. When he stamped it, the soft thud sounded like a ceremony, something closing gently. And I knew a final tether had been released. That evening, Margaret stopped by. I was in the garden, cutting lavender. She looked at me, paused. Something happened? I smiled. No, I just sent a letter. To who? To the future. She laughed quietly and shook her head. I think you're writing better than you speak these days. We sat on the porch, watching the sunset. Margaret said, I heard Sophie's shop has closed. I said nothing. Michael will have to start over, she continued. Maybe that's what he needs. I nodded. Everyone must learn through their own fall. The wind passed through, carrying the scent of rosemary. I remembered my husband's old words. Rosemary to remember, lavender to let go, mint to begin again. I whispered, I've remembered enough, John. Now I let go. That night, I kept the lights off. I sat in the dark, only the moon for company. On the wall, the painting of the Lake Placid cabin shimmered in the pale light. I looked at it. The small house, the slanted roof, the still water, the open door, and realized I don't need to go anywhere to arrive there. Lake Placid was never a place. It was a part of me, the part that learned to forgive without forgetting the lesson. I opened the ledger and wrote the final line for that night. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. Forgiveness is seeing everything clearly and still choosing to love. I love Michael. I love Sophie, but I will not save them. I love Ethan, and I send that love in the form of freedom. I closed the book and set it on the table. Outside, rain began to fall, soft, sparse, then steady. The smell of wet earth mingled with the lavender's faint perfume. I stood under the porch, watching the drops on the leaves, hearing the rain knock gently on the door of memory. And I was no longer afraid to open it, because inside there were no debtors left, only me, the one who survived. 2 weeks later, a small parcel arrived. Inside was a crayon drawing from Ethan. He had drawn a garden, an old woman, a boy, and a line written in crooked letters. "Grandma, I planted a tree. It's growing." I touched the paper, tracing each clumsy stroke. Then I laughed and cried. Not tears of pain, but the final tears of release. I hung the drawing beside the painting of the cabin. 2 worlds, one old dream, one new hope, side by side, blending into one. And I knew then, my story didn't need to end with victory or defeat, only with continuation. Outside, the light faded. The sky turned violet. I whispered, softly enough for the wind to carry. Love, if it is truly unconditional, doesn't stay to rescue. It leaves in peace and still loves. And I smiled. Peace was no longer a dream. It was here. In my breath, in the soil, in the small seed growing somewhere, where a child was learning how to stand tall. That autumn arrived as softly as a breath. No strong winds, no skies thick with flying leaves. Only clear, cool air and gentle light spread evenly across the road in front of my house, where the last footprints of my old life were slowly fading. 3 months since the letter to Ethan, I knew it was time. I put up a for sale sign at the gate, a small wooden board with white letters. It leaned slightly in the wind, just like me, old, but still standing straight. When the young agent came, he said, "The garden is beautiful. You've taken such good care of it." I only smiled. No one knows this garden was once watered with sleepless nights, with tears, and with loneliness. I didn't tell him. I only said, it grew on its own. I just helped it remember how to live. He didn't understand, but nodded politely. We signed the contract in the kitchen, beside a jar of dried lavender. When he left, I stood looking at the sign a moment longer. I didn't feel regret. I felt light. I packed in 2 days. Everything went into 3 piles. Keep, give away, leave behind. I kept only a few things. The box of brushes, the easel, the painting of the Lake Placid cabin, the jar of rosemary, and the ledger of silence. The rest, everything, even the china from all those heavy dinners, I left for the new owner. The house, once a cage for silence, was now empty but not sad. I walked around, ran my hand over each door, each wall. Every place had its own echo. Michael laughing as a boy, me cooking, the calls for help ringing out and then cutting off. I listened to all of it again and whispered, I forgive. Not anyone else? Myself. For letting those sounds imprison me for so long. On the morning I moved out, Margaret came early. She brought coffee and 2 waffles. We should have breakfast here one last time, she said. We sat, sunlight slanting through the window, laying golden streaks across the table. Margaret looked around, her voice slow. I remember the first time I came. This house was dark as a well, and now, she paused, looked at me. Now it's bright. I smiled. It's not the house that changed. It's me. She nodded. Good, because someone finally opened the window. After she left, I stood in the doorway, looking at the gate left ajar. I gripped the key, took a deep breath, then pulled it shut. The lock clicked, dry, but decisive. The old house had finished its job, and so had I. I drove north. The highway unrolled, maples turning brick red. autumn wind whispering at the window. I didn't turn on the radio. I listened to the engine, the wind, and my heartbeat. Steady, like a new music starting up after years of silence. When the sign for Lake Placid appeared, my heart slowed. Scenes slid past, straight ranks of pines, wooden houses pressed into the hillsides, the lake glittering in the distance like an antique mirror. I stopped on a small rise, turned off the engine, and stepped out. The air here smelled different. Cold water, pine, quiet. I looked toward the lake and saw my small wooden cabin in the distance, standing among birches, exactly like the image I once painted. I went inside. The room held only light and floating dust. A large window looked out over the lake. I set down the easel and sat. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. There was no one left to explain to, and nothing left I wanted understood. The first night at Lake Placid, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, the fire in the stove burning low, casting orange over the walls. Outside, the water took the moon and wore it like silver scales. I took the ledger of silence and opened to the last page. The first pages were dense with figures, sums, notes, dates. The later pages were stories, confessions, apologies. And now, the final page, clean and white. I lifted my pen and wrote, I have come here not to hide, but to come home. Forgiveness is not a gift we give others. Forgiveness is the room we open for ourselves once we stop self-punishing. I forgive Michael because he never learned how to be a son, only how to be someone in need of rescue. I forgive Sophie because she was never taught that kindness is not other people's privilege. And I forgive myself, the woman who stayed silent too long, loved too much, until she forgot she also deserved to be loved. I dipped the pen and added a final line. No more debts, no more ledger, only me. Then I closed it. This time, not to hide it, but to finish it. The next morning, the sky was so clear I could see the clouds reflected in the water. I made coffee and stepped onto the porch. The air was open, scented with wood and mist. Everything was so quiet, I could hear the leaves fall. I set up the easel and placed the old cabin painting beside it. On a fresh canvas, I painted the scene before me, but changed. The old cabin was still there, the lake still blue, but on the porch stood a woman. Silver hair, bright eyes, a cup of coffee in her hand, gazing out. No one else. It was me. This time I didn't hide myself in the painting. I stood in the center. Afternoon. Margaret called. I'm guessing you've arrived. I have, I said. It's so quiet it feels as if time has stopped. How long will you stay? I don't know. Maybe until the trees around the house change leaves, or until I no longer need to count time. She laughed softly through the phone. Listen to you. You sound like a sage. Not a sage, I said. Just an old woman who finally knows how to live. On the second night, I went down to the lake. The water was cold, clear, mirroring the whole sky. I sat on the wooden step and dipped my bare feet in. The wind lifted over my shoulders, carrying the scent of dried rosemary I'd brought from the old garden. I closed my eyes and drew a long breath. No images of Michael, no sound of Sophie, no accusing voice or pleading tone, only stillness, the very stillness I had spent a lifetime seeking. I spoke very softly, for the wind alone. At last, I have forgiven myself for living half a life in silence and for spending the second half brave enough to speak. When I opened my eyes, the moon had climbed high, laying silver on the water. I saw a woman there, slight, silver-haired, peaceful-eyed. I smiled at my reflection in the lake, not because I had won, but because I had stopped losing. The next morning, I woke early. The sun rose behind the pines, poured through the cabin window, and gilded the unfinished painting. It was the same light as in the first dream I ever had when I was young. Warm, gentle, and real. I picked up the brush and laid the final stroke. The painting complete. A woman at the center of the cabin, the door open, the lake bright. No other figures, none needed. I set the brush down, poured coffee, and looked out over the water. I knew my life didn't end here. It had just begun again. And I whispered the last sentence I had owed myself. I forgive myself for sacrificing my dream and for finally finding the courage to dream again. On the lake, the light trembled. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in decades, I could feel it. Freedom smells like dawn. Eleanor never defeated anyone. She simply stopped losing to herself. This story was never about money, or power, or revenge. It was about the return of a woman who once vanished within her own life. When she said no, it wasn't refusal. It was the knock of a soul newly reborn. Eleanor never sought to make anyone pay. She only made them see her, real, clear, no longer hidden behind kindness or duty. And in that gaze, her revenge was complete. Not through anger, but through a peace no one could ever take away again. And you? What about you? Have you ever been silent for too long? Loved until you disappeared? Paid the price for things no one even remembers? If you have, leave something below. It doesn't have to be long. Just a sentence, a word, a small sign to say that you're still here. Because perhaps, like Eleanor, you too are on your way to finding your voice again.